You sign this right now, or I promise you'll regret it." My uncle's palm came down flat on the conference table, hard enough that the water glasses on either side of us jumped. The estate attorney across from us, a quiet, careful man who had introduced himself as though he'd done so 1,000 times, went very still. The kind of still that says, "I don't want to be in this room." I looked at the documents in front of me. Power of attorney, broad and immediate. My mother's name at the top, my uncle's as the designated agent. I said I needed more time to read it. He stood up. He didn't touch me. He didn't have to. He leaned across the mahogany table, close enough that I could smell his cologne, the same brand he'd worn for as long as I could remember, and he said it again, quieter, more deliberate. "You have always had a problem letting people help this family. Sign the paper and go home, Lydia." The attorney cleared his throat, suggested we could schedule a follow-up. My uncle smiled, that flat, polished smile I had come to know the way you know weather changing before it changes. He said a follow-up wouldn't be necessary. I signed nothing. I walked out of that building into the February cold with shaking hands and something else underneath the shaking. Something that had been building for months and finally had a name. The story didn't start in that conference room. It started the night my father died, which was also the night my uncle decided the future of our family belonged to him. My father spent 30 years building a landscaping business from a second-hand truck and 2 employees and a stubbornness he called work ethic, and everyone else called something less charitable. He got up at 5 every morning and made terrible coffee and drove out before the sun finished rising. He didn't talk much about money or legacy or what he was building. He just built it. Once, standing in the kitchen while my mother hummed to the radio, he told me the business would be sold someday and split between her and me. He said it simply, like it was already decided, like the future was a room we'd walk into together at the right time. He died on a Tuesday in October, cardiac arrest, fast and absolute. He was 61. My mother called me from the driveway before the ambulance had left. I drove 40 minutes in the dark, and by the time I got there, it was already finished. She was sitting at the kitchen table in her bathrobe, both hands around a mug of tea that had gone cold. The house felt wrong in a way I couldn't have articulated to anyone who hadn't lost a parent. Like something structural had been quietly removed. We were still learning the new shape of everything when my uncle appeared. He was my father's older brother, 11 years between them, which had always made their relationship feel more obligatory than warm. He showed up on a Thursday, 3 days after the service, with a foil-covered casserole and a legal pad dense with notes. He said he wanted to help with the estate, said probate was complicated, and my mother shouldn't have to navigate it alone. Said he'd done this before, knew the process, could make things manageable. My mother, who was 63, sharp as she'd ever been, and entirely capable of managing her own affairs, said yes, because she was exhausted and sad, and at that particular moment, help felt like exactly what it claimed to be. I watched her say yes. I told myself it was temporary, that once the paperwork settled, things would go back to normal. I was wrong, and the ways I was wrong took time to become visible. The first several months, I had nothing concrete to point to. My uncle came by regularly. He took my mother to appointments, dealt with contractors, sorted through the business accounts, handled what felt like an endless stream of post-death administrative tasks that no one warns you are waiting. My mother told me he was a lifesaver. I was working full-time across town, trying to keep my own footing, and I was grateful to have someone filling in the gaps I couldn't reach. Then the small things started. My mother had always been precise. She remembered exact dates, exact figures, the wording of conversations from years back. She was the person in our family who reminded everyone else where they'd put things. Sometime around the 7-month mark, that changed. She lost the thread of conversations mid-sentence. She'd make breakfast, forget she'd made it, and make it again. She called me twice in one evening to tell me the same story, neither time seeming to register she'd already told it. My uncle said grief did this, said it was cognitive fog, completely normal, she just needed time. He started attending her doctor's visits and reporting back to me himself, rather than letting her describe what had been said. He started finishing her sentences when he was in the room. He started handing her a small glass of something every evening. A supplement, he said, for her heart. Her physician had recommended it, and he would stand close by until she'd swallowed it. The way he watched her take it bothered me in a way I couldn't justify yet. The conference room was 9 months in. I had gone to the estate attorney's office on my own, without telling my uncle. I asked questions I should have asked months earlier. I learned the business had been sold, I'd known that, but the proceeds had gone into an account I had never heard of. My father's life insurance policy, which I had seen once, listed my mother as sole primary beneficiary. A newer version of that policy listed my uncle. I want to be exact about what happened inside me when the attorney showed me that. It wasn't panic. It was colder than panic, like reaching for a doorknob and finding the door itself gone. I asked when the policy had been updated. He looked at his computer for a long time before he answered. 4 months after my father died. My mother's signature was at the bottom of the form. I drove to her house without calling ahead. My uncle wasn't there. My mother answered the door in her cardigan, a little slow to focus, like she'd been resting. We sat at the kitchen table and I watched her hands shake slightly while she filled the kettle. Something I'd noticed before and told myself was age, was cold, was anything else. I asked if she remembered signing anything about my father's insurance. She thought about it carefully, the way she'd started doing with questions, like retrieving things from further away than they used to be. She said she'd signed some things, that my uncle had explained them. Standard updates to the records after a death. I asked if she'd read them herself. She looked at the counter. She said he'd told her it was routine. I didn't push further. I drank my tea. I stayed 2 hours, and that night I went home and couldn't sleep, and by 2 a.m, I was at my kitchen table with a notebook, writing things down, dates, quotes I could remember, what I'd seen and when. I didn't know exactly what I was building. I just knew I had to start. There's a particular kind of grief that comes with realizing someone has been working against you while wearing the face of someone trying to help. It doesn't arrive as anger first. It arrives as a nausea that makes the floor of your own memory feel unstable. I found myself going back through the past 9 months, re-examining every conversation, every decision I hadn't questioned, and understanding for the first time that I had been meant not to question them. I found a different estate attorney, a woman who specialized in elder financial exploitation. I told her everything I had, laid out in order. She asked precise questions. At the end she said, "This is a pattern." She meant it in the legal, documented sense. She told me what to gather, what to preserve, what mattered and what didn't in terms of evidence. She told me to be patient and not show my hand. I went home and I started working in the way she described. Documenting things when you're afraid looks different from how people imagine it. You don't confront, you observe. You photograph rather than remove. You write times and dates in a notebook that you keep somewhere he wouldn't think to look. Mine lived inside a canvas tote bag behind my winter coats. You let the other person think they're the only one paying attention. I noticed the supplement routine more carefully. Every evening, same glass, same unlabeled container he kept in the high cabinet. My mother always accepted it, always thanked him. One afternoon while he was outside on a call, I photographed the container, slipped my phone back into my pocket, stood in the kitchen for a moment, listening to the sound of the yard, and reminded myself to be slow. My neighbor, the woman who had lived next door to my mother for 15 years, knocked on my car window one morning when I was sitting outside trying to organize my thoughts. She tapped gently twice. When I rolled the window down, she leaned in and said she'd been wanting to say something for a while. Her daughter worked at a geriatric care clinic. She'd visited my mother recently and had come home concerned, specifically concerned. not in a vague, general way. She'd noticed the changes, the supplement routine, the way my uncle positioned himself between my mother and her doctors, the way my mother's symptoms followed a specific pattern she recognized professionally. She couldn't make a formal assessment from a kitchen visit, but she said the picture troubled her. I thanked my neighbor. I cried in the car for 10 minutes after she walked back to her house. Not because it was news, exactly, because it was the first time someone outside of my own head had confirmed I wasn't inventing something. I found the other women by accident. I was running a public records search on my uncle's previous county of residence, a long shot, a late-night attempt to understand who he had been before he arrived in our lives. A civil judgment came up, attached to a property dispute, a woman's name at the plaintiff line. I sent a careful message, just a question. No accusations. She responded within a day. We talked for nearly 3 hours, different names, different setting, same skeleton underneath everything. A family member who moved in during a crisis, accounts quietly rerouted, a loved one whose health shifted in unexplainable ways, a legal process that took everything she had to get through. She added me to a group. 4 women total, different states, different decades, same blueprint. They spoke in dates and documents and phrases like the account I didn't know about, and I noticed it changed after. No drama, no performance. Just the specific, exhausting, clarifying language of people who had been through something and come out the other side with their eyes open. One of them had a background in estate law. Another had a contact in financial crimes investigation. They didn't tell me what to do. They told me what had worked. They told me to trust what I was seeing and to document everything before I moved. I stopped confronting my uncle, stopped asking questions when he was present. When he made decisions about my mother's care without consulting me, I nodded. When he began suggesting my visits were too frequent and disruptive for her routine, I adjusted my schedule without pushing back. He relaxed. I watched it happen in real time, the shift in how he held himself around me, less guarded, more confident. He started taking phone calls in the kitchen while I was in the adjacent room. He stopped treating me as a variable he needed to manage. That was when I heard the conversations. I won't reproduce them here in full. But one included the phrase, "She's not going to understand what she signed anyway," spoken quietly into a phone during what he believed to be an empty house. I sat on the other side of the wall. I did not move. Something inside me settled into an absolute, precise calm. The power of attorney attempt was a Saturday in February. He had framed it to my mother as a routine step, brought me along to project transparency. I had spoken with my attorney twice in the preceding week. I knew what the document was before I walked into that room. I knew what refusing would look like, and I did it anyway. And I walked out of that building into the cold. And my uncle called my mother that evening to tell her I was being obstructive and difficult, and that I'd always had trouble accepting help from people who cared about us. My mother called me after, relayed what he'd said, then went quiet. Then she said, "What is actually going on?" It was the clearest she had sounded in months. Underneath everything, she was still there. I asked her to trust me for 1 more week, to sign nothing. She said, "Okay, steady, immediate." And I held the phone after we hung up and thought about how long she had been waiting, underneath whatever was clouding her, for someone to tell her it was okay not to trust him. My uncle had a standing Thursday Civic Association commitment he never missed. On a Thursday in late February, my attorney filed a formal petition with the probate court citing evidence of financial exploitation and undue influence. A financial crimes investigator who had been reviewing the documentation I'd gathered submitted a concurrent report. The supplement container, which I had with legal guidance, retrieved a proper sample from 3 weeks earlier, had gone to a laboratory. The results were reviewed by the investigator, who shared them with my attorney in language that was not technical but was very clear. 2 officers arrived at my mother's house that evening, calm, professional, a welfare check and a document hold, executed by the book. My mother's physician came herself, I was already there when the knock came. My mother held my hand through the whole thing. She seemed somehow to understand more than I had assumed she would. She answered questions clearly. She held on. Across town, at the Civic Association's monthly meeting, someone walked up to my uncle during the intermission. I heard about it afterward from the investigator. How he laughed first. That smooth, practiced laugh he kept ready for moments that required managing. How he started explaining, fluently and with great confidence. How the confidence drained when they told him what they had. How the people he had cultivated carefully in that room, the reputation, the surface, the civic presence, stepped back from him, just slightly, just enough. The charges were financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, fraud and forgery, the insurance policy change, the redirected business sale proceeds, the account funded with my mother's assets. Those formed the center of it. The supplement situation added charges that are still being fully adjudicated, and which I won't summarize here because I'm not a lawyer and the details are specific. The women from the group submitted documentation through proper channels that established prior conduct across 2 states. Pattern evidence is not a minor thing in cases like this. It changed the weight of everything. At sentencing, 8 months later, he received 4 years. The financial restitution was substantial. His attorney, on the record, noted that the documentation against his client had been unusually thorough. I thought about the canvas tote bag behind my winter coats. My mother's recovery was not immediate. Her physician had prepared us for that, carefully, so we wouldn't expect something that looked like a switch being flipped. But within weeks of stopping the supplements, the fog began to lift in slow, unmistakable increments. She slept through the night. She followed conversations without losing the thread. She started the crossword again, which she'd abandoned months earlier because she'd said she couldn't hold the clues in her head long enough to work them out. One morning, I arrived to find her at the kitchen table, half a puzzle finished, a cup of strong coffee beside her. She had always had particular opinions about coffee, a preference I had almost forgotten about, and she looked up and said, "I need you to tell me everything that happened. Don't leave things out because you think I can't hear them." So I did. She listened without interrupting, which is not her natural mode. When I finished, she was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I knew something was wrong. I just couldn't find the edges of it." She meant the fog had felt like it was coming from inside her, not from outside. That's the specific cruelty of what had been done. It had convinced her that the confusion was hers, that the forgetting, the drift, the difficulty holding on to things was just who she was becoming. It wasn't, she cried eventually. I did too. Then she made more coffee, and we sat in the kitchen while the afternoon came through the windows, not saying much, just being in the same room in a house that felt like ours again. The bills came back to the table, nothing hidden, nothing coded. My mother started attending a support group for financial exploitation survivors. She found it on her own, didn't ask me first, just showed up and came home lighter. She began volunteering at the library on Tuesday afternoons, something she'd talked about for years, but somehow never managed to get while my uncle was managing her time. I went back to work at a different pace. I started spending evenings helping connect people from the group with resources. Attorneys, investigators, advocates, not because I had expertise to offer, because I remembered exactly what it had felt like to sit in a car at 2 a.m. with a notebook, no one to call, not entirely certain I was seeing what I thought I was seeing. One of the women told me once that the hardest part hadn't been the money, it had been the doubt. The long period of questioning her own perception so thoroughly that she had nearly convinced herself she was wrong, that she was being dramatic, that she owed the benefit of the doubt to the person who was taking everything from her. I understood that down to the bone. There is a version of this where I signed the paper in that conference room, where I told myself I was overreacting, where I let his certainty outweigh mine because it was louder, and because the attorney wasn't meeting my eyes, and because saying no to someone who presents himself as family feels, in that moment, like in gratitude. I almost chose that version, not because I was weak, because silence is almost always easier in the short term. It costs nothing right away. The price comes later, at a rate you never agreed to. What I want you to understand: if any part of this felt familiar, if you read this and recognize something you've been trying to name, is that the doubt is not an accident. The confusion, the second guessings, the sense that you're being unreasonable for asking questions, that is not your character. That is the mechanism. It is built to feel like it comes from inside you. It doesn't. Write things down. Find one person you trust without reservation. Ask one careful question, and notice what the answer does to your breathing. You don't have to move fast. You don't have to be certain before you start looking. My father used to say the best thing you can do with your hands is make something last. I think about that differently now. Some things are worth making last. And some things, the silence, the deference, the habit of telling yourself you're probably wrong, are worth being the one to end. If this story felt familiar to you, share what you're comfortable sharing below. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. You never know whose story finally gives you the words for something you've been carrying for too long.